Welcome to the Deal Doctor Livestream, Monday. And today's topic is post-closing surprises. So we thought we'd start with one of our own, which is to start 10 minutes late. So I'm so glad that you stayed, if you did. But Facebook changed its signing on process, so it took a little longer than we expected. And the first portion of this is in Classroom, so you can pick up a little bit of it there, a very small amount, by the way. Mostly what I said in that segment is tomorrow is our big day for the Charity Golf Classic. It's going to be exciting. We're going to have fun. Hope to see you all out there. If you are golfing within, I would say, 100 yards of me, I would recommend a helmet and chest protection. I'm just saying. Thankfully, the foursome that I'm in understands that I am golf challenged and should always stand somewhere a good distance behind me. So that's we already know that, but it's going to be fun, and I'm glad for all of you who are supporting it, and we're going to see you tomorrow, and it's going to be a great deal of fun. Before we go and talk about the post-closing surprises, there was a question that was raised in Kim's class, and I want to address that from a couple of perspectives. First of all, the question was, if an agent lists a property at a given price and gets an offer that is considerably more than that, does that agent have the right to raise the price, obviously with the seller's consent and signature, but do they have the right to raise the price before the appraiser gets out there, for example? You've seen this practice for quite some time, but I want to caution everyone on it. Do they have that right? And the answer is yes, they have that right to do it, according to the attorney for Michigan Realtors, Gail Anderson, who is also our attorney. But it is a practice that is subject to some discrepancy, I guess. And let me explain what the Grand Rapids Association of Realtors position is on it. When we asked, are agents allowed to do it? And you may be allowed to do it, you're probably allowed to do it in your multiple listing systems, whichever one you belong to. But here is a genuine caution if you go down that road. And I'll read the quote from Julie Rietberg. Although we don't refuse if the appropriate amendment is submitted and signed by the sellers, we have advised against it for a number of reasons. In some cases, agents want to increase the price in an attempt to impact the appraiser's opinion of value. Our legal counsel has suggested that this borders on fraudulent activity since it does not reflect a true picture of why the price was increased, i.e., it is deceptive in that the facts were distorted based on circumstances and the parties collaborated to promote a falsehood. The appraisers we have talked with unanimously agreed that one of the first things they look at is history. If and when they see someone that has modified the price when simultaneously pending it, they know precisely what the agent is attempting to do, and they're immediately turned off by the tactic. They have all said that manipulating the price has no bearing on the result. Some appraisers, quote, who prefer to remain anonymous, unquote, have gone so far as to suggest that if there is a value range in their conclusion, they might even return value at the lower end of the range in cases like this to drive home a message. Whether or not that's appropriate either. Ultimately, modifying the list price after the fact distorts the true history of what happened with the listing and also distorts the statistic when running percentages of list price to sales prices. Once the property is closed, the actual price can be used for search criteria to be used as comps. So, keep that in mind. The appraisers don't recommend it, and most multiple listing systems don't recommend that you raise a purchase price based on getting an offer, that you raise it above the listed price to the higher price of the purchase agreement. The appraisers are going to see right through that, and it could be considered fraudulent because it doesn't reflect the house, it reflects the circumstances of the particular sale. So, with that, let's get on to fun stuff. Really, really fun stuff. Post-closing surprises. The reason this popped into my head was at some point on Saturday when it was pouring rain and we had thunderstorm and tornado warnings and everything. And I thought, here they come. This is going to be a week where we deal doctors are going to deal with agents whose buyers are calling them because they have wet basements, water in the basement. And the seller never mentioned it. The seller swears that they never had water in the basement in the 40 years that they lived there prior, and so on and so on. And sure enough, I got 2 calls on Sunday regarding wet basements. Imagine that. And we're going to get more. This will be a week of wet basement calls because of the water going through all of the tributaries on its way out to Lake Michigan. It's going to happen. We have a lot of clay in Michigan, and when clay is dry as a result of the low rain levels that we've had, it doesn't absorb water very well, and in fact tends to run off. It's not like sand. Sand, water just percolates right through. Loamy soil percolates right through. Clay doesn't. And so once clay gets saturated, it also tends to hold the water. And so you may have a foundation that has a level of clay against it, and that is actually holding water and building pressure against the side of that foundation underground. So I can tell you that you're going to get calls as a whole. You're going to get calls about wet basements. And what do you do about those things? Well, as I was thinking about the answer that I would give you about what to do when you get that call about the wet basement that never was wet before, ever, what else? What other things do we encounter a lot when it comes to post-closing surprises? And one of the other issues that we run into a lot is possessions or debris. We'll call it possessions if it's like something halfway decent, like maybe a couch or a chair or something, and then just plain debris, just junk left behind in the house or the garage or the barn or where on the property itself. So we run into that. Wet basements, items which should have remained but were taken. In other words, if they had a chandelier, for example, in the dining room, and that chandelier showed up in the listing contract and in the appraisal, and then suddenly it was gone when the buyer moved in and took possession, and it had been replaced with a $37 chandelier from Home Depot, you probably would have a case that the buyer could go after the seller to get that more valuable chandelier returned unless it looks worse than the $37 one. So, and there goes the truck. So, another issue that we run into is seller or tenant won't vacate after closing. Now, if the seller has possession after closing for 30 days, for example, and day 31 comes up, what do you do if they say, well, we still haven't found a place to live, or we can't move into our place until next week or next month or whatever. Same thing with the tenant. What happens if the tenant refuses to move out? Again, these are issues that do happen, and how do we deal with them as agents? Well, first of all, we are not attorneys. We cannot enforce a contract. In fact, attorneys can't enforce a contract. Attorneys can only threaten to file for damages, for example. The only one who can enforce a contract is a judge. It's really simple. So, when you get to the question of, for example, wet basements, what do you do? How do you determine whether or not that wet basement was disclosed? It probably was not disclosed if it comes as a surprise to the buyer. So how do you prove that that seller knew that that wet basement that the basement got wet occasionally at other times prior to the closing? Well, sometimes neighbors will know. They might have neighbors might have had the same problem, that the whole neighborhood tends to get a little bit of water when there's a lot of rain, for example. Sometimes there are other clues. For example, stains of water wicking up into the woodwork. If you see that when you're showing a house, there's probably a good chance that that house has had water at prior times, and I would, frankly, for my buyers, question that seller's disclosure if it didn't disclose that there had been water issues in the past, if those kind of signs exist. Sometimes there's a watermark on the basement wall. Other times I've seen it where there's mold or mildew that has comes up to a certain place, and that's a pretty good indication they might have had a consistent water problem prior to close. Again, all of those things you can see beforehand. But one of the cases that I got a call on over the weekend was one where the seller swears up and down that they've lived there 40 years, that they absolutely positively have never had a water problem. And let's pretend for the moment that they're telling the truth. Notice I said pretend. But anyway, the point is, if they disclose to the best of their knowledge, honestly, that they'd never had a water problem, and then suddenly it popped up after the buyers purchased the property, what are your buyer's options? Well, your buyer's options actually are to fix it. And here's why I mention that. Here's the situation that we've had in the last several years. We've experienced high water tables, rising lake levels. This year, we were below lake levels, below in terms of Lake Michigan, for example, but also in rivers and creeks. But the amount of rain that we've had in the last several days could change that picture dramatically, and it will change the level of water tables, which affect water's ability to get into basements. So it's very possible that the seller may have never experienced this for 40 years. And that in this one particular case, with this heavy amount of rain that we had, for example, on Saturday, they may be getting water in the basement. And the only thing that they can do in that circumstance is see whether or not that water issue, that water damage, is covered under their insurance policy, or if they're going to have to fix it themselves. If it's not covered under insurance, they may want to see if they can get insurance in the future, but for this particular incident, it's probably not going to be covered. So that's the answer to wet basements. We're going to get the calls. Be prepared to field them. And we're here to help, but bottom line is, if the buyer feels as though they were misled, that they were that the nature of the property was stated to them on the seller's disclosure form, then they may have legal recourse, but they're going to have to hire an attorney to go after it and find out and determine whether or not they have a case or not. Possessions and debris left behind is another big one that we get calls on all the time. It may be a stack of paint cans. It may be just general debris. I've heard it from mild to really, really awful. One of them required 3 of the big dumpsters to be filled and moved, 3 of them. And so you can imagine how filled with junk that particular property is. Some of the things you want to look for when you're showing a property is what things, can you predict this? For example, if there is on an agricultural piece of property, very often the owners would dump cars and vehicles in a hole in the back, the back 40 acres, okay? They had basically what they call a junk pit, and they would actually drive old vehicles, old machinery, anything that they didn't want back into the hole. Well, if you're looking at the property, if you're touring the property and you see that, you probably need to ask yourself before you write an offer whether or not that is going to be removed from the property. Because if you don't write it in the purchase agreement and make it specific, the likelihood is very high that that's going to stay there. Same thing if you go into a basement that has a lot of stuff, or a pole barn, or a shed that has a lot of stuff that doesn't appear to have a great deal of value. Anticipate. Look at that and say, is that going to be removed? If that's not going to be removed, if you put it in the purchase agreement, or if you write in there that we're going to set aside a certain amount of money to ensure that the seller makes the property broom clean condition at the point of turning over possession to the buyer, that may be a way of avoiding your buyers getting a nasty surprise when they get there and they've got junk everywhere. Again, there's an upside and a downside. The downside to that is that if they have multiple offers on this house and you include that language, they may accept somebody else's offer. So the question is, do you put that in or not? Well, I guess that depends on how important it is to your buyer whether or not they end up needing to clean the seller's junk out of the house. Because if there's no legal teeth in this phrase that says they have to leave it in broom clean condition, then the seller or the buyer is left to take the matter to court and see if they can get some sort of compensation for having cleaned up the mess. Another issue which comes up a lot is items which should have remained with the property. I mentioned the chandelier. I've seen it where they've taken TV mounts, which actually should stay with it, or mini blinds, which should stay. The canned recessed lighting, for example. I've seen them take and strip copper wiring out of houses and take the doorknobs off, leaving the house completely accessible, unlocked, and even taking bathtubs out. So when you go through the house, again, when you're touring the home, I think you need to ask yourself, what's the likelihood? Is there anything in here that a seller would take thinking that they belong to the property? Well, let me first of all address things like hot tubs, refrigerators, stoves, utilities of any kind. you should put on your purchase agreement and specify that those things are to remain with the property if that's your intent. If you don't care whether they take the stove and fridge and hot tub, fine, don't put it on the purchase agreement. But don't assume simply because it's mentioned on the listing contract that it's going to stay with the property. That's an assumption which has gotten a lot of agents, including myself, in trouble because I ended up buying a hot tub for a client of mine because I didn't put it on the purchase agreement. It was hardwired, hard plumbed, on a pad, bolted to the pad. I assumed it to be a fixture. It was included in the listing contract, and ultimately our attorney said it could go either way. It's a 50-50 shot if you take this to court. And I thought, you know what? It was my mistake. I'm going to write out the check for $3,000 and they can go and find something else. What happens if the seller won't vacate or the tenant won't vacate? Now there is language in most of our contracts that if you are a tenant in sufferance, that you are required to pay a certain amount per day. But in order to get that amount, you're going to have to take that, the buyer's going to have to take that seller to court and say, number one, here's an eviction notice, and oh, by the way, we're charging you $100 a day that you stay per the contract that we wrote. Some agents don't put any amount in there. And so there's no consequence to the seller ignoring the possession date. They can stay there for free, even though they're in violation of the contract, because there's no tenancy and sufferance consequence listed in the purchase agreement. In either case, whether it's a tenant or a seller, obviously if it's a tenant and there is a time frame that they have to list the house or stay in a house, you're going to have to honor those that contract, that lease agreement, according to tenants' rights, or you're going to, and when that's up, you're going to have to evict them, probably. Same thing with the seller. If the seller is violating their tenancy agreement per the contract, you're going to have to take them to court. In all of those cases, in these post-closing surprises, and those were just some of them that I came up with today in preparing here, but in all of those cases, there's a very strong likelihood that it's probably going to be handed off to an attorney for an attorney to review and determine whether or not there are damages which the buyer can pursue. And of course, when you do that, you start racking up costs. It is not our job, and in fact, it's our company policy, that when one party has lawyered up, when we get notice that one of the parties has hired an attorney, we need to inform our client that the other party has hired an attorney, and we recommend that they do the same. We have to step back and allow those attorneys to take over. We cannot become involved in negotiating a settlement at that point, because we then have stepped over the line into practicing being an attorney. So just a few cautions. If you run into a situation where the contract has not been satisfied after the closing, or there is an issue, a surprise, whether it's a furnace, hot water heater, any of those things, these issues are going to be between the buyer and the seller. It's going to be a matter of the buyer suing the seller or trying to get some sort of compensation. So you're, of course, always welcome to call us, but you may want to refer your client to an attorney for an attorney's advice when you run into this kind of a situation. So, with all that happy news, I hope to see you all tomorrow at the golf outing, those of you who have signed up. And I will not see you here next Monday because I won't be here. Okay, have a great day. See you in 2 weeks.